We've got the donuts, we've got the animation. Now it's time to do our final lovely render. So we are rendering using the Cycles rendering engine, which, to jog your memory from the rendering video, the way it works is, turning off denoise, is it starts with a very noisy image with a low sample count, and then over time, you can see in the top left there, it throws more samples at it, and it refines that image to be cleaner and cleaner, essentially. So if we were to set this maximum sample count to a really absurdly low value, like say 10 samples, you can see it renders very quickly, right? It's done almost instantaneously, but it's so noisy that you can't see any of the detail. Now, there is the magical denoise function, which we will be using. However, that is not... It does solve a lot. It's definitely helpful, but it's not perfect, especially for animations, because on each frame, the sample variation, even though it's set to be stable, there will be variances frame to frame. So if you're using a low sample count, this AI denoiser, it will do its best, but it'll still have like splotchy patterns that will appear. And you can actually notice it if you go looking for it. Like the other day, I was watching one of Mr. Beast's videos, and there was like an animation in it. And I was looking at it and I saw like all this splotchy stuff like on the sides. And I was like, oh, damn, that team must be on like a really tight deadline because they did not have time to render out the proper samples. But anyways, so I did a few tests for this exact scene here. You can see this is with 20 samples. You zoom into the background there, you can see splotchiness. It's especially noticeable in out of focus areas, which I'll show you how to do that out of focusness soon. But you can see it's very splotchy and you wouldn't ever want to use it. 50 starts to look a little more stable, but still the splotchiness is very noticeable. You don't want that. 100, this is where it's starting to look usable, but still not great. I wouldn't consider that good. 300 samples is where I consider the bare minimum for a scene like this. But ideally, you would be able to go up to 500 samples, which is where a lot of that splotchiness is so negligible that you don't really notice it. And if you have time or you don't mind rendering, overnight or something like that, or maybe a couple of overnights, 1,000 samples will get you an even cleaner looking result. So for my max sample amount, I'm going to go with 500. And by the way, there is viewport and there is render, and these settings are identical. I was tweaking viewport before because I was showing you in the viewport, but obviously it's what's in the render settings, which is going to be saved into your final animation. There is also noise threshold, also known as adaptive sampling. And the way this works is it will try to look at the image and determine which areas are already clean enough, and then which areas need more samples, like dark areas where there's not enough light or something, and it'll throw more samples specifically into that area. And it's very efficient, and I would love to use it. Unfortunately, it doesn't play well with the denoiser. With the denoiser, it can create splotchy areas, which are not good, obviously. So if you're using the denoiser, which, let's face it, is probably 99% of the time, then you can't really use the noise threshold. At least as far as I've seen, I haven't seen it work reliably enough. So uncheck noise threshold. Samples, I went with 500. Try to go, if you're on a laptop, maybe 300, but try to go up from there and you'll get a nice clean result. There's also time limit. I almost never use this, but this just puts like a cap on each frame. So if, I don't know, the samples was gonna take the image to like 25 seconds to render, if you set your time limit to be 20 seconds, it would just stop at whatever sample count 20 seconds gives it, and then it would move on to the next frame. But as I said, I almost never use it. I just want to use the exact sample count. Awesome. Now you might remember previously that when you want to do a render, you go render image, or you hit F12, and then this will kick off a single still render. And then from here, if I wanted to save this image, I would go image save as. Well, what we want to do is we want to render a sequence, like every single frame. And so to do that, we want to use not just render, but render animation. And when you do that, it will use and it will save the file for you in whatever you put in the output settings over here. So if we bring this out over here, you can see your resolutions defined up there. You got your frame rate, yada, yada, the output one here. So this is the folder where it's going to save the file to. and then your file format. I'll just move this up. This is a really important one. Now, you would think that because we want to create a video file, right, that you could upload to Instagram or YouTube or whatever, that you would want to use one of these movie settings, maybe an AVI or an FFmpeg or something like that. But you would not. You would be wrong. But it's a common mistake a lot of beginners make. The reason you don't want to ever render a scene directly into this format is that if at any point during the rendering process your computer was to crash, or let's face it, Windows was to do another update overnight and you can never figure out when it's going to do it and it just does it randomly, and if it was to do that, you would lose everything that you have rendered has just vanished, because it will not have created any file that you can actually read. So instead, you always render to still images, okay? So you want every single one of these frames to create a PNG and then put it into the output folder there, which you will then later take that sequence of 300 PNG images, let's say, or it's 160 in this case, and then put that into another process, which I'll show you, to create that final video file. So PNG is actually pretty good for most cases. If you want to go a slightly higher quality, you could use TIFF. If you really know what you're doing, you could use OpenEXR. But the problem with that is that it will not use, it won't embed like a display transform in it. So it'll save it into linear format. Technical jargon just to say it's going to look terrible if you don't know what you're doing with it. So generally speaking, PNG or TIFF is the one you want. Never JPEG. The compression on that is terrible unless you're just throwing a still image up on Facebook or something. But PNG or TIFF, that's fine. And the color depth, you could go 8 or 16 bits. 16 bits will give you a lot more range, but it will be larger files. Unless you're planning to do color grading in something like After Effects or Nuke or something, I wouldn't bother with 16-bit. 8 should be fine. So you set your output folder to be something that makes sense. I usually just create a folder called frames. And then within here, I just create another subfolder. I call it like 1, just because you almost always need to render multiple times. But anyways, you create a subfolder there called 1. And then, I just kick off the render by going render animation. But before you do that, it is a good idea to check your scene to make sure that you haven't got any mistakes, because you're going to be rendering, and usually you're rendering overnight or maybe a sequence of days, and you don't want to have to go through the whole process of rendering only to bring it up and then go like, oh crap, I forgot to turn on that layer, or I forgot to fix that problem, or I didn't notice this before I did the render, and then you have to do the whole thing all over again. So here's a checklist. First, in solid view mode, click this little drop down next to your viewport overlays and then go face orientation. Now, what this is showing you is which faces are facing the correct direction. So the face is the solid part of the mesh and it's like paper thin, right? But there is a correct direction and there is a wrong direction. So the correct direction is the direction that the camera and the shader expects to see, and it can render correctly. If it's showing you the opposite side of the face, it means that the shading is likely to get screwed up. So if you see anything in your scene that is red, it means that it is facing the wrong direction, okay? So in this case, it thought that the kitchen should be rendered outside, right? Because it was a cube that we started with, so it puts the faces outside it, because it wouldn't know that we want to render inside it. So in this case, if you have a red face like this, you select it, select everything on the mesh just by tapping A, and then you want to hit Shift N, okay? Now that should fix it. If it doesn't, because on the case you want to have it facing inwards, like in this case, this little recalculate normals box here, if you click that, you can then click the checkbox that says inside, or a hotkey for it is Control Shift N, and that will do a recalculation inside. Anyways, long story short, you just want to make sure that everything you see is blue. If you've got anything, a sprinkle or a donut or a plate or anything like that, just make sure everything is showing up as blue, because that's very important. All right, so now that's done, I can turn that off. The other thing that you want to check is that you haven't got any rogue objects that will be showing up in the render that you don't want to be there. Like, for example, this weird looking little UFO thing, right? These little sprinkles that are just hovering off into space here. So that is because we've got some sprinkles which are being referenced on our geometry node stack, but we don't want these individual ones which are being referenced to appear in the render. So on the sprinkles collection, I'm just going to uncheck this little camera icon, and that means it's viewable in the viewport, but it's not going to appear in the render. This will will not affect the objects over here. When it's referenced in a geometry node system, it's just going to treat that as its own separate thing, and it's not going to hide it from the render. But it just means that these 5 little reference sprinkles will be invisible in the render. The other thing that you want to check is to look at your intersections, okay? Because looking at my donut, look at that. Wow, I've got a massive intersection. And this would be noticeable because the camera is now moving and it is above it, right? So you don't want to have intersections. So I'm actually going to use this as an excuse to slightly reorient my donuts and create a much more appealing looking stack, because I was experimenting before I hit the record button, and I thought if I just create, you know, both of these stacks so they're kind of like leaning on each other, then I rotate them a little bit like this, then I take this donut, I could move it out, rotate that, yeah, something like this. There we go. Right, and then, oh yeah, I'll rotate this a little bit more. It's a leaning tower of donuts. I'll move that out a little bit. But really, with this many objects on top of each other, you're bound to have something that looks a little funky. So just look at it from different angles. I mean, the most important one is the camera, right? Making sure that it is sensible. But because we've got a moving camera, it kind of has to look good from multiple angles. The other thing I noticed also is it would look a lot better if I could see the top of this donut here. So I noticed if I select this stack and I rotate it like this, almost like it's on the edge of that plate there, like the lip, and it's kind of leaning this way, it looks a lot nicer. Yeah, see, now I can see the top of that donut, and yeah, just feels a lot nicer. Might actually rotate a little bit further, and then I'll move it up, rotate this one, and I'll pull that in a little bit. And that's pretty good. That's not bad. All right. There. So that's a lot more interesting, and I've also corrected a lot of the intersections there. But, you know, as I mentioned before, guys, this is a tutorial, and I can't fix everything whilst I'm running the tutorial. So have a look at your scene, and have a look at, you know, the plate. Is there a donut which is hovering above the plate like it is here? Make sure that it's not, or at least make sure that it is not in a place that's noticeable, because that will not be good, and you'll be I mean, I actually finished the final animation sequence for this tutorial, and then noticed right at the end that one of the donuts was like this, and I just didn't notice it right until I did after the render sequence was complete. And actually, a coworker of mine was also working on the scene, helping render some extra sequences, and he didn't notice it either. And we were both like, "Damn, how did we miss that?" Because you just don't go looking for it. So I'm calling it out now because I'm sure a lot of you watching have got intersections, and it's good to try to fix it now. Another one to check for is your lighting and your exposure ranges. So first thing I know is that looking at this is good. It's putting a lot of the attention on the donuts, which is great. But this, everything here in the background is just, it's so dark, it's almost hard to see. And it feels a little bit too moody, right? It's almost like a Rembrandt painting or something like that. I want it to feel a little lighter, a little bit more friendly. So on the roof here, on the ceiling of my kitchen, I'm going to shift and then right click to put my 3D cursor there. And then right at that point, I'm going to add in an area lamp. And I'm just going to move it down slightly just to make sure it's not clipping through the surface. And then, yeah, let's go look in this. So this is what it is with it off. And then if I just increase this, you can see it's just adding a little bit of fill light to the whole scene to just feel a little bit lighter and a little less, extreme in its light choice. But yeah, that looks pretty good. Now, by the way, this power value, there's something called the inverse square law that applies to all light in the real world and in 3D software. It just means that if something is double, like twice as close to something, it means it's going to be 4 times as bright. So what this means is that I've just added in an area lamp, right, at the top of my ceiling, but that's because this is just the size of the box that I've got. If yours is a little bit shorter than this, right, then when you placed it, then this lamp and this lamp energy that we've just defined here as 10 watts is going to be a lot brighter. So don't copy the values that I'm putting here. Have a look at your scene and try to evaluate it and go, is it bright enough? Is it too bright? Do I feel that this fill light is too overpowering? right? Or is it underpowering? Just evaluate it and try to do it as fairly as you can. And something that I recommend, and this I do a lot of the time for a lot of final renders, is underneath your color management. If you go to view transform, change it from AGX to false color. Now, this obviously you never want to do for a final render, but this is revealing to you what is the exposure range of different parts of the image. Kind of like if you're using a camera and it's got like a zebra thing to like show you which parts are clipping. This is like that, but it's like to an advanced level. Essentially, it's showing you, I mean, I'll put this up from the Blender documentation, but it's showing you what is the exposure range of which parts of the image. And there's no like right or wrong here, but generally speaking, you want to have a nice range because then it's showing there are parts that are in light and then there are parts that are in shadows, and there is a range there so that you can reveal the form. There are exceptions to it, but generally that's the idea. Now, in my case, I want to make sure that really there's very few areas that are in the red or the white. The white means there is actually no information there because it has clipped. So that is not good. It's okay for a few areas, right, where there's a few highlights, but generally speaking, you don't want too much. Now, in my case, I think it's a little bit too high, so I'm just dialing it back. And just so that I get most of, the part of the donut where it's hitting the light, it's mostly in the orange to yellow range with a very small amounts of red or white coming through. So once I'm happy with that, make sure you change it back to AGX, otherwise you'll be rendering to false color and that will look horrible. A few other aesthetic choices. I noticed that the pink was a little bit too hot. The saturation does make a difference. So I'm just gonna dial it back to around about a 0.6 value. I also noticed that this yellow color was a little bit too close to mustard. So I'm just gonna tweak the hue here just to make it a little bit more exciting, kind of like a banana yellow, right? And a little bit brighter as well, just a little bit more cheerful. The blue, I'm gonna make a little closer to an aqua, which is a little more funky, a little, I don't know, more interesting, at least to me. The base color, oh yeah, this one here. So I decided after looking at this and evaluating it, I'm like, I should just go with the white icing like what I had in my my final render. So just creating a new material, call it white icing, right? And also for the donut, I noticed I forgot to put subsurface scattering on the donut itself because donut, although it's bread, right, it's not going to have as much subsurface scattering as the icing, but it will have some, right? So I'm going to give it a weight of 1, radius, make sure that's always set to 1, and then this value here, let's go 0.01 like that, which I think is actually more than the icing that we gave it, but anyways, it works because it's kind of doughy. We can kind of get away. Maybe I'm having second thoughts right now. We'll go 0.01. Why not? Make it look a little bit more stylized and cartoonish. The other thing that I can see looking at this is that this part here, right, with these ball sprinkles on it, it's very like high frequency detail, which is just like a technical term to mean like small detail. Artists always invent terms just to sound smarter than they are, but it looks high frequency, right? And it's a little too high frequency. It's good to have some small detail, but not that small. It's just, it's kind of gritty and it's kind of like, it's sticking out like a sore thumb to me. So what I'm going to do is go to my geometry node setup just for my round sprinkles here. And by the way, also make sure you're looking at the correct one, not long sprinkles. Uncheck that little pin if you've got it like I did. And then I'm going to change the round sprinkles scale, dragging down to 1.5. So it's a lot bigger, which means I can use a different distance min value, 0.002. And whilst I'm here, I'm also going to change the distance value for the long sprinkles because I noticed it was feeling a little too even, the distribution of these, which generally means that with this Poisson disk distribution, it's using the distance to make sure that they're all perfectly evenly spaced, and it's a little bit, it's too big, essentially. So I'm going to set this to 0.004 instead, which means you will have some overlaps and some clipping, but if we use a lower count here in our setup, like 80, for example, or even lower, right? It should feel a lot more natural, right? It doesn't look like before it was like 200 when it was, this was 0.006, and now it's like 30, but it still almost feels like the same as what it was before because that distance, when you lower it, you're getting more sprinkles in there, even though it's a lower sprinkle density. Anyways, technical. Also lower this one because that's just too many, so let's go like 50 for that. And that's pretty good. You can also experiment. Like I tried changing the different, like whether this one has long sprinkles or whether this one at the top has round. You can play around with these. I went, I think the bottom one I gave long. This one, I'm going to turn it off. So no sprinkles on that one, and just try and get a nice, feel for it. You're just trying to go for something that looks a little balanced in its detail, so you don't have too much repetition across it. So I'm trying to get a nice breakup of like round, long, none, round, etc. The other thing, since we're talking about detail, is looking at this, right? This is small detail. This is small detail. These shapes here, right? This is large detail. Okay, so we've got large and we've got this small detail. We don't have any medium detail. And it's good to have a variance across the scene. Just, I don't know, it's one of the design rules. It just helps things feel a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. So something I saw when I was looking on Pinterest many years ago for one of the old donut series was like, you can put bigger sprinkles, like a few big chunky sprinkles on it. And it just adds variance to it and it just makes it look a lot more appealing. So for that, you could do it using geometry nodes, but I just do it by hand placing like 3 sprinkles. So on this donut here, shift right clicking on this part of the donut. I'll go into, here we go, solid view mode, and then shift A, and then I'm gonna add in a UV sphere. Default settings are okay. I'm just gonna scale it down like that, right? So this is the size of the sprinkle, quite big. You could imagine it almost as like a gumball or something. It's probably not big enough to be a gumball, but you know what I mean, like something big, right? Make sure you're using shade smooth. And for the material, sorry if this is like getting too in the weeds, but a lot of people when they're following tutorials, they like to know the exact settings that I used. So I'm trying to show them all whilst not taking too long. But yeah, there we go. So I go for like a aqua color. Yeah, like that. And then I want to turn the roughness like all the way down like that. Cool, and now I just need to duplicate that sprinkle. So duplicate here, and I'll pull it out, and I'm just gonna go with 3. You could go for more, but I'm just gonna go with 3. And I'm only gonna put it on this donut. I'm not gonna bother with the others. I'm gonna say this is the special one. This is the one that we want your eye to be drawn to. So this is the one with a little bit more detail than the others. I'm sorry if I'm doing a horrible zigzaggy job of, I could do snapping, but I'm like, it's just too much work to do the snapping functions for this. So I'm going to select those 3, shift select the icing, control P, and then go keep transform. There we go. So now they're all attached to that. Just in case I move the donut, it's correctly done. The final thing I think I changed was the world settings underneath the air and dust for our sky texture. I just dialed it back to around about a 0.7, just a little bit cooler in the lighting, right? As I might remember, I told you, if you go all the way there, it's like the sky just becomes like blue. And if it's too far up, then it becomes yellow and orange or whatever, like kind of too decayed. But like a 0.7-ish, it just feels a little cleaner in comparison to what it was. Awesome. Now we're almost there. I promise you, we're almost there. The one thing that you probably do want to know how to add is depth of field. It adds a lot because every single camera in the real world has depth of field, except for pinhole cameras, interestingly, because there is no optics in a pinhole camera. So it can have like infinite depth of field, supposedly. Anyways, the depth of field settings is underneath your camera. Okay, so select your camera, then click on the data here, and then depth of field right at the bottom. So check that box and everything will become blurry because it doesn't have a focus object yet. So click the little eyedropper tool and then just click on this icing, this pink donut icing right in the front here. And there you go. So that is depth of field. It used to be really difficult to do in Blender. I started 20 years ago and it was this horrible like motion blur thing you had to do for the camera to like rotate it. Anyway, it's just a checkbox now. It's fascinating. Anyways, the f-stop, if you're unfamiliar with cameras, the lower the f-stop, the shallower that depth of field. So you can see very little of this image is actually in focus. So it's actually good for like miniatures. But if you want more of the scene to be in focus, like you want more of this donut stack to be seen, I would go with an f-stop somewhere between 6 or 8, something around that range. I think I went with 8 for my final one, or maybe it was 6. Can't remember. Anyways, but you can see the stuff in the background there is now out of focus, and it puts the attention where it should be, right on those donuts in the middle there. And the other thing that I always forget to enable is motion blur. So underneath your render settings here, you just need to check motion blur. And I actually find the default setting is usually fine. It's a little smooth, like it's a little bit too blurry sometimes, so you might want to drop it to like 0.4 or something. But I don't know, it should be defined with the default. It usually looks okay. So, are we ready to render our final animation? Well, I actually thought yes. So that little jump cut that you saw there was me going, yeah, let's render that animation. And then I rendered it out, and then I came back and I went, wait a minute. I've made some errors. Bom, bom. Now, can you tell what they are? I will give you a clue. Right here, right here, right here. We're missing those 3 little balls that we created, little sprinkles. And then also, look in the background here. Mysteriously dark, almost as if the area lamp that we added is not there. So I'll first of all say, it's very common to do this. You think that you're finally ready, like, yeah, everything looks good, kick off the final animation. I've sometimes waited like over a week for a whole animation to finish, and then I come back and then I open it up and then I go, oh no, I forgot to turn off that layer. I forgot to turn on that layer. I forgot, actually a technique that Pixar uses, I learned at one of the SIGGRAPH presentations they did. They said they render the first frame, the middle frame, and the end frame of every shot before they do the full animation sequence, because that usually reveals any problems in the animation, which they can then correct. So I should have done that, but didn't. Anyways, what was my mistake? Well, when we disabled this sprinkles collection, right? We disabled it from appearing in the render. That's fine, but when we created these objects, I didn't check what was the active collection. So when you add a new object, it adds it to whatever is the selected collection, this little one with the little box around it. So obviously, it put it inside of that collection. So these spheres should not be inside the sprinkles. So I'm going to drag it out into a donuts collection, which is where it should be. And then this area lamp as well. That's the reason that the background is dark, is because that was inside the sprinkles, so it was hidden from the render as well. So now putting that into the environment, that now should look a lot better. So do a test render just by hitting F12, see how that looks first, what I should have done. I mean, even just doing one render could have revealed this problem. It's that obvious. But do a test render, check, look, we've got the balls appearing, the fill light is now in the background. And the other thing I noticed, and this is because it's the next day that I'm recording this, when you look at something with fresh eyes, you often notice different things. So I thought that this exposure looked pretty good, but then now having a look at it the next day, I can see that it's a little overexposed. Okay, so if you look at the false color, this is what it looks like, and there's just too much orange there. So essentially I'm going to drop this back to be, so it's like mostly yellow across the front of these donuts here. Well, not mostly yellow, but more yellow than what there was before. There's not really an exact way to sort of pinpoint it, but I could just tell it's a little overexposed. So I'm just dialing it back to be a little more reasonable. Again, your exposure ranges might be different depending on, how close your donuts are to the window or something, but look at it with your own eyes, and if it looks wrong when you're using this exposure range, use a different value, tweak it, and try to make it look accurate. Because actually, I was on Discord this morning looking at some of your renders. Join the Discord if you're not on there. And I was like, okay, a lot of people also have overexposed renders, so I should bring that up. Anyway, we are now finally ready to do a render. So again, I am using no noise threshold, 500 samples, probably get that up to 1,000 if you want it to be non-jittery, denoise, open image denoise, and then I'm outputting it to TIFFs, just RGB, we don't need alpha, 8-bit, and then I'm just putting it into a folder, which, because I made a mistake, I'm going to put it into another folder. I actually made 2 mistakes, rendered it twice. I'll put it into a 3, right? That's why I put them in subfolders. Anyways, now that I'm ready, I'm going to go render animation. And this is now kicking it off. I can now leave it, walk away, and it will just start, as it finishes rendering, it'll just start dumping it into the folder. And there you go. So you can see it's rendered 3 frames. So we've got 3 images here. Once it's finished, we should have 160 TIFF files inside this folder, which you will have to watch the final part of this tutorial to learn how to take that sequence and form a video file that you can use and send, etc. So click here to watch the final part of this tutorial series.